Part 4. Building a New Scripture. Chapter 13. Checking Behind the Curtain. Among the few certainties one picks up after some time in the history trade is that the readers own the story. That holds universally. They decide what the narrative means. There is, though, the simplest of tricks that can nudge the meaning in a predetermined direction. Namely, with any bundle of events, apparent meaning is often determined by where one decides to drop the curtain. For example, if one is chronicling a victorious revolution, the story ends in trumpets and heroics and glowing success, at least if one stops soon after victory over the old regime. If, however, one waits a year or two and keeps the curtain up on the subsequent fratricide or civil war that is almost paradigmatic for revolutionary struggles, then a lot of apparent success turns into inhumanity and failure. In a parallel religious case, if we brought down the curtain in our present discussion at the point we reached in the preceding chapters, the mid-1890s, we would have a mild, almost domestic end to the narrative. A complex new form of Christianity had emerged out of the sectarian insecurities of the Anglo-Irish ruling class and had, through intermediate stops, notably in England and Canada, been naturalized in the United States. Of course, a one-sentence summary is blindingly simple, but one could paste on all the necessary filigree and qualifications and porcupine epistemology and still legitimately argue that the overall result was a success story. A new entity, an intriguing, intellectually challenging, personally enriching, and at moments beautiful constellation had been added to the New World culture. Like so many imports from the Old World, it was streamlined and improved by its enculturation in American society. Perforce, one could assume that each of the three main branches of what is later called dispensationalism had found its niche, and that each of the individuals who were the emblems of the overall movement had themselves been admirably successful. Granted, Dwight Lyman Moody, James Hall Brooks, and the late John Nelson Darby had encountered a few problems, but in the mid-1890s, it appeared that dispensationalism was sitting comfortably in a space between the various evangelical denominations. Proponents of its alternate forms were keeping their knives sheathed, mostly. For the moment, dispensationalism was like a leaf with palmate venation. Variations branched out from a single stem and were part of a single entity. Now, jump forward 10 years. If the curtain rang down in 1905, one would note how ragged relations had become within the dispensationalist movement. Like secular utopian revolutions, this religious one was laying down the preconditions for its own domestic civil war. Splits in core beliefs, major operatives turning on each other, coup-like attempts at conferences and institutions, the opening portents of future fragmentation. That is what concerned historians might have seen, and they well might have perceived these as being more important at the structural level than the apparent richness of increasing Bible schools, summer study conferences, and missionary societies. Such social appurtenances could fall apart even more quickly than had been their rapid creation. That interpretation would be just a hypothesis, nothing dogmatic, but a good place to drop the curtain. Ernest Sandin has a revealing one-page chart that simply gives the birth dates and the ages at the quarter-century marks, 1875 and 1900, of the major players in the Niagara Conference. The chart makes the point that by the end of the century, the main players in the Niagara Conference group were mostly in their 60s and 70s. Thus, a bit later, by 1905, Most were in their 70s or were gone. That is an analog to a phenomenon often noticed by political historians of revolutions. Individuals of a similar age are associated with seminal ideological changes, and once they become aged or pass away, when they are replaced, this frequently induces a secondary generational shift. In dispensational circles, this second shift had occurred by 1905. Specifically, missing entirely were the patrician James Brooks, deceased 1897, and the leonine figure of Dwight L. Moody, deceased 1899. Both had been pan-denominational, and they had suppressed the argumentative voices in their ranks. To this one adds Maurice Baldwin, deceased 1904, A.J. Gordon, deceased 1895, S.H. Kellogg, deceased 1899, George Needham, deceased 1902, W.R. Nicholson, deceased 1901, and Daniel H. Whittle, deceased 1901, each of whom had been a significant player in the Niagara or the Northfield events, and in some cases at both. Some of the older generations still had teeth and were not to be toyed with, but undeniably as a group they were easing back. The still active older set were George S. Bishop, 69 in 1905, deceased 1914, William J. Erdman, 71 in 1905, and showing no signs of slowing, deceased 1923, William G. Moorhead, 69, acute scholar, deceased 1914, Henry Parsons, 74, still ambitious, deceased 1913, Arthur Pearson, 68 and active, deceased 1911, and Nathaniel West, 74 in 1905, feisty, deceased 1906. These men were no longer running things, but they had a voice. They were, however, being shouldered aside, month by month. This was not a case of Girondins and Jacobins, but it was a shift, nevertheless. The next generation that one sees taking majority control was not in 1905 very young, but it was markedly younger. The key figures were Cyrus I. Scofield, 1843 to 1921, Arno C. Gabeline, 1861 to 1945, James M. Gray, 1851 to 1935, Elmore Harris, 1854 to 1911, and Reuben A. Torrey, 1856 to 1928. There were others. The shift that was occurring opened fissures where talented younger men could rise, and just useful older men who previously had been blocked could obtain influence they previously had been denied. An example of the sort of person who came to the fore in the generational shift was Robert Cameron, 1839 to 1927, whom it would be easy to dismiss as an Ontario backwoods Baptist who really should not have been playing with the big kids. Ernest Sandine did not make that mistake. He called Cameron the catalyst in the controversy that dissolved the unity of the late 19th century students of dispensational truth. Mind you, on the surface, Cameron could be taken for a rusticated amateur of low ambition. From 1875 until 1885, he was the pastor of a church in Brantford, Ontario, seemingly going nowhere. Actually, Cameron came from a well-established family, apparently had money, and he had been around. His father, a lieutenant colonel, was the son of a United Empire loyalist who had done well out of loyalist land grants. Robert Cameron had a good education at the equivalent of a secondary school in upstate New York, and he took a B.A. at University College in the University of Toronto, 1868 to 1869. Then he assumed a pastoral charge near Rochester, New York, married, and next represented the Grand Ligne mission in Britain. There he met personally with many of the UK brethren, including George Mueller, Benjamin Wills Newton, and John Nelson Darby. He interacted several times in North America with Darby and with Mueller. This included seeing Darby when the great man was just breaking into the New York area and was doing Bible readings in unprepossessing kitchens. And Cameron also was close with James Inglis and Charles Campbell. Cameron served for 5 years as a pastor in New York and did additional service in the Boston area before settling in Brantford, Ontario, 1875 to 1885. In his Brantford pastorate, he was not in the back of beyond as far as radical evangelicalism was concerned. Brantford, in 1881, a town of about 10,000, was a small manufacturing hub on the Grand River. The locale was a focus of exclusive Brethren missions, notably those of the Grant brothers, James and Robert, who dealt both with the 6 nations of the Grand River and with the European-derived population. Thus, in a quiet way, Cameron was on the circuit. He was on the organizing committee of the 1878 First Canadian Christian Conference and its 1879, much more dispensational successor. In between, he had been one of the long list of clergymen who put out the call for the famous 1878 New York Conference on the Second Coming of Jesus. In the 1880s, he was on the edge of the Niagara-on-the-Lake group, but not a major presence. When Cameron reflected on the twin dispensational conferences of 1885, first the Canadian-initiated one and then the regular Niagara session, and chatted aloud about his growing doubts about the secret rapture, it was not a big thing. As long as local uncommitted pastors were soft-voiced in their doubts, they were permitted attendance. Cameron's doubts had been framed in probably 1879, when G.F. Mueller had been in Toronto for the second of the Canadian Christian Conferences, and it explained why, years earlier, he had realized that he had to choose between Darby and the Bible on the secret rapture question. At Niagara-on-the-Lake, perhaps in 1885, but more likely 1890, Cameron took Nathaniel West aside and expressed his doubts about the secret rapture. They had a long discussion in prayer session, and West, the most prestigious of the prophetic expositors, he had been the convener of the great 1878 First International Prophetic Conference, declared, "Cameron, I begin to think you are right. I will give these matters careful and exhaustive attention, and if I find that the Scriptures teach contrary to what is taught in this conference, I will reverse myself and boldly defend the truth." Or so Cameron remembers. The story is slightly wobbly, but it is clear that a serious declension in the dispensationalist ranks was becoming manifest, and looked to turn from a fissure into a deep chasm. Cameron cites the following large figures who had come out by 1897 against the twinned concepts of the secret rapture and its necessary corollary that this would happen before the Great Tribulation. Otherwise it would not be a secret, any moment occurrence, but would have been signaled by unmistakable signs, such as the appearance of the Antichrist. Nathaniel West, W. J. Erdman, H. W. Frost, J. M. Stifler, and the late A. J. Gordon, deceased 1895. Others followed after the deaths of Brooks, 1897, and Moody, 1899. Relationships among the dispensationalists turned rancid, and the 1900 Niagara Conference was the last. And after Moody's death, Northfield continued to be successful with various conferences, but by 1904 these were generically evangelical and outside the dispensational orbit, and were not deeply engaged in the doctrinal Methodenstreit. The split among dispensationalists is one of those things that, understandably, social and cultural historians of North American society at the turn of the 19th century take a look at, then read the minimum to avoid gross errors, and eyes averted walk away. Understandably, it is a tacky battle among intense, vain, smart, narrow men, most of whom would have been deadly as dinner companions. Yet, to be fair, in some sense, the more sensitive of the combatants were fighting for their lives, for if the other side was right, then they themselves had wrongly read the divine plan of salvation, perhaps at their own eternal peril. If one is wrong about the climax of Christian history, how sure can one be about the faith track that leads up to it? But again, understandably, outsiders find all this unattractive, in part because the battle has been labeled with yet another eye-glazing piece of theoneologism. Early in this study, we accepted the need to accept the contemporary terms of distinction between postmillennialism and premillennialism. Now, alongside them, we have two branches of premillennialism: pre-tribulationalism and post-tribulationalism. Of course, we have seen this fight before, except without the labels. The late 19th and early 20th century's fracas was almost a perfect repeat of the clash between Benjamin Wells Newton and John Nelson Darby that began in 1839 with the publication of Darby's Notes on the Book of Revelations to assist inquirers searching into that book. Both men were convinced of the future, literal, physical second advent of Jesus, and both interpreted the Scriptures as being a sequence of dispensations. And those two affirmations, amidst all the welter of hermeneutic splinters, were also held in common by the chief men on both sides in 1900, this common ground making their arguments all the more potentially vicious. If, for a brief moment, we consider one portion of the job description of evangelical preachers at the top of the dispensational phalanx, the terrain on the battleboard becomes clear. All these men were producing a consumer product. The religious professionals made a living selling an intangible item, salvation, providing in the present a heartfelt certainty and in the future, eternal life. Within this context, at first glance, it is hard to conceive that the post-tribulationalists had much chance. The post-tribulational view, grossly oversimplified, was that the true believers, either those at present on earth or those who would exist in the future if the Lord continued to tarry, would have to experience the Great Tribulation before the literal manifestation of Jesus. The details of that horrific period, probably of 7 years' duration, as declared in Matthew chapter 24 and articulated elsewhere, especially in the book of Revelation, were well known to those who studied their Bibles. That, for the post-tribulational viewpoint, the non-secret rapture of the physical Jesus to take his saints heavenward and his appearing with them from heaven to rule the earth could be separated by just a blink of an eye in earthly time was a nice detail, but not much of a comfort. At the retail level, to convince potential believers to embrace the idea of themselves or their heirs going through the Great Tribulation was a very hard sell. In contrast, the pre-tribulational package had a lot going for it. The saints on earth would miss the hideous tribulations. There would be 7 years between the secret rapture and the appearing of Jesus to rule the earth, and since the secret rapture could happen at any time, the blessed hope was that it would come happily and suddenly, before any of the believers had to undergo mortal decline and death. If, as was the case for most of the dispensationalist leaders, one's terrestrial living depended on convincing ordinary men and women to join a cadre and pay financial dues, it would seem to be manifestly perverse to choose post-tribulationalism with its promise of true believers experiencing for a time near hell on earth. Yet, instinctively and harshly protective of their own belief systems as some of the chief men could be, we have to grant both sides their sincerity They were not merely communicators of a product, they were themselves believers in it. Among the cohort we are studying, I am convinced of that. Whatever else you may think of these men, very few of them were charlatans as far as core beliefs were concerned. So if one side or the other made a compelling scripturally based case, it had a chance. The pre-tribulational system was so well known that it did not need anything other than repetition. But balancing the sides, their post-tribulation opponents had an elegant library of work that most of the North Americans had already forgotten existed, and which would be easily pillaged for material. This was found in the mid-century works of Benjamin Wills Newton, and especially of Samuel Prideaux Tregelles, perhaps the strongest evangelical biblical scholar in the Anglophone world in the Victorian era. As with any real attempt to convince an opponent, the biggest hurdle was the initial one, to gain the opponent's open attention. Heavy arguments, however accurate, rarely convince anyone. That is why Robert Cameron was so crucial. A fair summary might be that he had an inveigling personality, just a little bit sticky and moderately ring-kissing, but not Uriah Heepish. He was the easy, often amusing man whom people liked having around. Thus, in the 1890s, he became an assistant editor of The Watchword, that Adoniram J. Gordon, 1836 to 1895, had founded in 1878, and which included a good deal of Brethren writings, both sorts, but mostly Darbyite. Cameron became close with Gordon, and as we noted earlier, believed he had converted him to post-tribulationalism. In any case, upon Gordon's death in 1895, Cameron took over The Watchword, a move that was eyebrow-raising to some observers. At the same time, Cameron found his way into the counsels of James Hall Brooks, who permitted him to publish an article in The Truth questioning the earliest apostles, and especially the Apostle Paul's expecting the second coming of Jesus in their lifetimes. Cameron tried to talk Brooks out of the any-moment rapture, and according to his own memory, got so far as obtaining the concession from the old master that the early Christians indeed did not expect the return of Jesus in their own day. But because of his own fear of death, Brooks stayed hopeful that in his own day the second advent would occur. The two men talked of merging their periodicals, and after Brooks's death, Cameron purchased The Truth from Fleming Revell and became editor of a new journal, The Watchword and Truth, beginning in July 1897. Thus he had a platform that he controlled until mid-1921, when it was sold to Fleming Revell and folded into the Record of Christian Work. In the short run, 1900 to 1901, Cameron used his platform to encourage a rapprochement between the two sides, and he seemed honestly to think that they could exist within the same tent, and maybe even continue the Niagara-like conferences. A series of at least 5 meetings, mostly public or semi-public, plus private negotiations, were held in 1900 to 1901, to no avail. Additionally, Cameron put together 2 very private discussions, one in London, England, and the second in Seattle. Nothing worked. Divide became chasm. Robert Cameron used his position as editor of Watchword and Truth to attack directly the concept of a secret rapture as occurring before the Great Tribulation. Cameron framed his doctrinal belief merely competently, and considering the sources he had to draw on, especially Newton and Tregelles, it was disappointing. Even in its most developed form, as repeated in his 1922 book, his argument was clear, but not anything that would knock down the walls of Jericho. It was this: there is no place in Scripture that says the church would be taken away before the tribulation. The Scripture speaks of saints living on earth at the time of the Antichrist. There is no scriptural difference between the second coming and the appearing, however defined, and the idea of two resurrections is absurd. It is all extra-scriptural. Clear enough, but unless one already were half convinced of his view, it was not going to bring anyone around. Where Cameron made his inroads was by walking outside the tight doctrinal lines of battle and talking to his colleagues as men who were in the same line of service he was, and who had encountered the great figures who shaped their own shared professional history, or at least were familiar with their work. When off duty, these colleagues thought and talked about things just as any other set of professionals do, and Cameron's deft touch was to introduce into the conversation some legendary chief men whom he had known personally. Mueller, Brooks, West, Darby, Tregelles have already been mentioned, plus James Inglis, Charles Campbell, George Needham, and others. He did this as if they were mutual acquaintances of his readers. He was saying, let's talk about things deeply, but in human terms as well as doctrinal words, as I did with our old mutual friends. Cameron was good. Instinctively, he understood that if he could get his audience to think in human terms, as well as in the necessary doctrinal abstractions, he would be halfway into their hearts and minds. The key move Cameron made, so obvious that one wonders why it had not been engaged previously and often, was to ask where and when did the belief in the secret rapture come from? That is a very human question, and as Cameron cannily knew, it demanded a human answer. He pointed out that there always had been a few true Christians, going all the way back to the apostles, who believed in the pre-millennial and personal physical return of Jesus. Whether or not that is accurate is not being discussed here, and that their unity of belief was upset nearly 90 years ago, when a new belief, a view never heard of before, came into being in Britain and has steadily spread over the whole of Christendom. This new belief posited the secret rapture, which came out of Edward Irving's work, Cameron pointed out, and the extra-scriptural view of two resurrections, of a distinction between the rapture and the appearing, the believer's escape from the Great Tribulation, and the conversion of the Jews, all of which were packaged together, and the new view was promulgated by Mr. Darby, C.H.M. Trotter, Stanley, and others. In America, through the writings of Mr. Darby and C.H.M., almost every pre-millenarian accepted without due consideration this secret rapture and its related beliefs. Now, there is no profit in parsing the details of Cameron's historical conspectus, but he had the basic point right, that a new system of Christianity had been revealed, discovered, or invented in the British Isles in the 1830s. In focusing on the secret rapture and its discovery or invention or creation barely 100 years before he was himself writing about it, Cameron was being very canny, pointing initially to the luminescent flare that everyone could see. Once readers gave their attention to that phenomenon, Cameron had a fair chance of transferring their awareness to the complex and massive gantry from which the flare emerged, the dispensational system articulated in the 1830s in Southern Ireland by the early Brethren. The diamond-sharp intrusion here was that even if his colleagues disputed some of his historical assertions, Cameron nevertheless had deflated much of the magic in the dispensationalist system. That system had not come with the halo of the writings of the apostolic age, but from the known, and still readily purchasable, original writings of John Nelson Darby and of the early Brethren of the 1830s. And Darby, Darby, was the one name that was not to be mentioned in U.S. dispensational circles. Robert Cameron's manifest intention was to discredit the main forms of dispensationalism in America, and he was successful to a point. Cameron was opening up an unsettling issue that always has sat at the heart of North America's dominant form of radical apocalyptic evangelicalism, the constellation of beliefs that had first been knitted together in the big houses of Anglo-Ireland at quite a recent date. The matter of what is original in any precept or practice has always obsessed Christian authorities. In conservative evangelical quarters by the end of the 19th century, the word original had become almost a supernatural term in itself. The original scriptures, before scribal errors and defects in transmission from one generation to the next, were taken to be of divine origin and as being without error. Within this mindset, personal originality of the sort one credits an artist or author with is not possible. It could not be claimed for any martyr or theologian, or even for the Church Fathers. Truly divinely inspired beliefs and practices were directly derivative from the Holy Scriptures, in the same way that a tight syllogism dictates a specific conclusion. Granted, one can hide from this problem when a brand new belief structure is being assimilated by using terms such as discovery or recovery or reawakening. This was what was being done as early as the last quarter of the 19th century. Further, one can create a false chain of continuity concerning the general doctrine of premillennialism, not its subcategory, dispensationalism, running back at least to the 4th century and often to the Apostolic Fathers, as was done as a standard exercise at most of the prophetic conferences, either in separate papers or as part of other discussions. Or one could go even further and assert that there always has been a thin, at times almost secret, chain of transmission from Bible times down to the present expression of an idea. So, the new idea is actually an old original. Whether or not the formulators and repeaters of this claim were themselves convinced of both the reality and the relevance of this historical parade is an interesting question. All such moves, however, are a form of white-knuckle time travel, for they do not contribute to a satisfactory explanation of the creation and spiritual imperialism of a very complex system of belief that no one had heard of in 1830, since it did not then exist, yet had by 1900 taken over a major tranche of Anglophone evangelicalism. Further, it had gained influence within several Protestant groups that detached individual parts of the dispensational and assimilated them. Plymouth Brethrenism in its first 2 generations was unashamed of its own innovative force in bringing to light, in the view of its advocates, a true reading of the Scriptures that had been lost for the greater part of 2,000 years. With the Brethren, both open and exclusive, it is necessary to emphasize that they had an entire new system of their own: hermeneutics, ecclesiology, salvation, grace, and a complete script for all of human history, not just about the last days. Thus, when someone, such as B.W. Newton, who was within the Brethren system, suggested in the 1840s that the secret rapture was a doctrine altogether new, they were slicing at Darby, but not undermining the proto-dispensational system. They had a version of the end times that they believed worked equally well within the dispensational system. Unlike the first time the issue was fought, in the 1830s and early 1840s, it no longer was an in-house battle. In the early 20th century, the prophetic movement was tied closely to public revivalism, and the any-day coming of Jesus was a great motive for conversion. Because the prophetic movement advertised itself widely and skillfully in the books, newspapers, and periodicals of the day, the compelling assertion that the secret rapture had a recent and very human origin was easily picked up by critical outsiders. The great danger was that rival evangelical groups, Methodists in particular, could easily argue that if the pre-tribulational secret rapture was tainted by its very recent and very human invention, then the post-tribulation second coming also was a fruit from a poisoned tree. That would leave the post-tribulational return of Jesus following the millennium as the residual alternative. To summarize the situation as of 1905, at their core, the radical evangelical apocalypticists were not in good shape. They were doing well enough institutionally, but were in danger of discrediting themselves by a mutually eviscerating public debate about their own authenticity. The victory would go to whichever band found someone to repair its claim to possess the proper sort of originality. Not personal or even human originality, but something so deep, so beyond doubt, that their audiences could only believe that it came directly from God. The triumph of the most radical of the systems of radical apocalyptic evangelicalism occurred through the totally unpredicted creation of a new text, an achievement that eventually affected wide bands of evangelical believers throughout the Western Christian diaspora. Text, control the text, and one owned the faith. The unlikely magus who best understood that fact was Cyrus Scofield.